What's up everyone, this is another compilation of hands from 2023. I haven't been able to play too much live with a newborn, but when I have been out, I've been playing some of the tournament series. We just had the Texas Poker Open at Champions and the Poker Atlas Series in Houston. Regular vlogs will be returning in the near future, and I hope that you guys enjoy. This was a 10-20 game played at the Win. We currently have a $40 straddle. This opponent recently sat down, so I haven't played too many hands with him, but so far he has seemed like a recreational player. The $40 limp in middle position further indicates this. I raise it up to $150 in the cutoff with 5-4 of hearts, and he makes the call. We go heads up to the flop with the pot at $370. The flop is the 9 of hearts, 4 of spades, 3 of spades, giving me middle pair, backdoor straight, and backdoor flush draws. He checks, and I think I want to be continuing at a pretty high frequency with this hand. This specific combo gains a lot of EV from denial. My opponent's almost always going to have 2 overcards, and folding out those combos is always going to be beneficial. I'm also going to be gaining value from some of his overcards that have the backdoors, as well as his flush draws. With this specific opponent, I don't think I'm going to be folding out any better combos. My opponent does make the call, and we go to the turn, which is the 7 of hearts, and my opponent decides to do something interesting here, and he donk shoves for 3x pot, approximately $1,800 into the $600 pot, and now I'm in a very weird spot. Obviously, I'm going to be folding a large portion of my range, facing this size of a bet. I think my hand has just a little bit too much going on for it when I picked up the flush draw and the straight draw on the turn to go along with my pair. I'm ahead of all my opponent's draws, and if they do have a made hand, I have a ton of outs. I flick in the call, and we decide to run it twice. The first run out is the 3 of diamonds, and the second run out is the ace of diamonds. Thankfully, it happens to be good as my opponent flips over the queen jack of hearts that turned the flush draw, and I scoop this $4,200 pot. A little later into the win session, a loose cutoff opens it up to $120, and an aggressive player 3-bets the small blind to $420. I think he's going to be 3-betting here very wide, especially versus a loose opening range in late position. Typically, the small blind is going to be playing a very aggressive strategy here in general. I look down at pocket 9s in the big blind. I don't often have a flatting range versus an open and a 3-bet, and I think versus this loose 3-bet, 9s is perfectly reasonable to 4-bet. I bump it up to $1,100. The cutoff folds and the 3-better calls, and we go heads up to the flop with the pot at $2,400. The flop is the 7 of spades, 6 of clubs, 3 of hearts. This is a board I'm going to be betting at a very high frequency. I'm just going to be using small sizes in a 4-bet pot, as the stack to pot ratio is much smaller. I continue for $625. He makes the call. I expect his range to consist of pocket pairs that are stronger than mine, although I do expect his aces, kings, and queens to be putting an additional bet in pre-flop. Possibly he does the same with his jacks or 10s, although those are going to be calling at a much higher frequency. But I think he's going to be continuing any hands that have decent backdoors. So any ace-x with the backdoor flush, as well as some broadways with backdoor flushes. And I think his strongest ace-x combos like ace-king, ace-queen, and possibly ace-jack are all going to be continuing as well, regardless of their suits. The turn is the 2 of spades, and my opponent checks again, and I decide to continue here for $1,200. I think that continuing with this hand is definitely on the cusp, as my opponent does have those overpairs that are stronger than mine. But I think this specific combo does want to deny equity from overcards. Like I said, he's going to still have all of those ace-king, ace-queen combos, as well as those combos with backdoors. I expect him to be continuing with a lot of his ace-king still, and some of his ace-queen. But if he hasn't picked up a spade draw, I expect all of his weaker ace-x combos, as well as all of his broadways to be folding here. And I figure being in position, I can just check back river, and I don't lose any additional money versus the jacks and 10s. He once again makes the call, and I think at this point, he often has those stronger pocket pairs than me. I guess there's a chance that he does have something like 8-7, or pocket 8s that I'm gaining value from. But primarily the hands that I'm ahead of are going to be ace-king, ace-queen, and flush draws. We go to the river with the pot at 6K, and the river is the 3 of clubs. He checks, and I check back. There's no merit in betting my hand at this point. I'm not gaining value from any worse hands, and I'm just hoping that he has an ace-high combo that I beat. Fortunately for me, he does have ace-king of spades, and I scoop this 6K pot. In this hand, there's a hijack limp. I open up ace-9 of diamonds on the button to $40. The small blind calls, and the big blind decides to min 3-bet to $80. The hijack folds, and I have a pretty easy call. The small blind calls behind, and we go 3 ways to the flop with the pot at $250. The flop gives me the ace-high flush draw on the jack of diamonds, 2 of spades, 7 of diamonds. The small blind and big blind check, and I decide to continue for $175. Obviously, my hand has a ton of equity with the flush draw and the overcard, but I'm perfectly fine getting folds as well. The small blind continues and the big blind folds. I think the small blind's often going to have worse flush draws here, but primarily going to have Jack X and pocket pairs. I think if she does have a hand like pocket 2s or pocket 7s, she's going to be check raising at a very high frequency. So I expect mostly middling pairs, something like 6s, 5s, and then Jack X combos like King Jack, Queen Jack, Jack 10. As well as some 7x combos like 8-7 and 7-6. There aren't too many worse flush draws as I do block a lot of the combos, But she could possibly have something like king queen, queen 10, something lower like the 6-5 of diamonds. We go heads up to the turn, which is the jack of clubs, and my opponent checks, and I decide to check back. I think it makes sense to check back a lot on this turn card. If my opponent does have a jack X combo, they're really not going to be folding, and they're often going to be raising as well. I think that although my hand can bloat the pot, it really doesn't want to be facing a raise, and by checking back, I get to see a free river. If she does have a weaker pair, I get to realize my equity. The ace and the 9 are often good, and I can always turn my hand into a bluff on the river as well. The river does give me the flush as the 4 of diamonds comes in, and my opponent decides to lead for $350. And I think my hand is just a mandatory shove here for value. Yes, she can have some full houses, but most of those pocket 2s and pocket 7s are going to be raising on the flop. Although pocket 4s is possible, it's only one hand in her range, and her range is going to consist of a lot of jack X that'll call a shove, as well as some weaker flushes. I go all in for $1,045 effective. She tanks for a long time, and she ultimately does flick in the call. I think by being deceptive on the turn and checking back, I'm going to be called by jack X at a much higher frequency. I'm not sure what she ended up having here, but I end up getting the max value with my nut flush. I open up pocket 2s to $60 in the hijack over the $20 straddle. Player on the button makes the call. This player currently has a nip button, so they're incentivized to play a lot of hands to win a hand and get rid of their nip button. We end up going heads up to the flop with the pot at $135. The flop is the 8 of diamonds, 10 of clubs, 7 of hearts. I elect pot control and I check, and my opponent continues for $75. I'd expect my opponent to be continuing here with a large portion of their range because they have the nip button. I think hands that have weaker showdown value like ace high are going to be betting at a high frequency by him. I also expect hands that are going to be mixes like all of his Broadways to be continuing with a bet here. So I decided to make the call with my pocket 2s. We go to the turn, which is the 7 of spades, continuing the rainbow. I check again, and this time my opponent uses a pretty sizable bet of $250. When he polarizes in this situation during the nit game when he still has a button, I expect him to be bluffing even more often, as his larger sizes are going to apply a lot more pressure. The 7 of spades specifically is going to reduce his value range quite a bit as well for a polarized sizing. It's very unlikely he has a hand like 8-7 or pocket 7s, or even other 7x combos like a7, 7-6 that wanted to gain denial. So even though pocket 2s is a pretty weak hand here still, I think with my opponent over bluffing that pocket 2s is still a strong enough hand to continue with. That being said, there are a lot of bad river cards. My opponent's always going to have over cards, and the 7 pairing is also extremely bad for my hand, as now a 10 or an 8 will counterfeit my hand as well. I make the call and we go to the river, which is the 4 of clubs. 6-5 is the obvious hand that gets there, but overall I'm going to be ahead of all those Broadway region combos and most of his ace X that have barreled here. I decided to check and see what my opponent does. He does check back, so I think I win here a decent amount. As I think at this point, when he's already double barreled, I think he is going to give up with some of his bluffs, as he doesn't expect me to be folding too many combos at this point. With a rainbow turn, no backdoor flush draws came in. I think for the most part, a lot of my value range is going to be connecting with this board pretty strongly. Unfortunately for me, my opponent does have 4-3 of spades, and they end up hitting bottom pair. And I had the right read, but the river was the one my opponent needed. I'm sure he would have put me to the test on a lot of other rivers though as well. I would have had a very difficult decision, but feels tough losing this way. I open up in this hand to $60 on the button with queen 9 offsuit, and the straddle continues. We go heads up to the flop, which is the 10 of spades, 2 of clubs, ace of spades. My opponent checks, and I decide to make a very low equity bet here for a small size of $50. I think overall I'm going to have a pretty strong range advantage here, as I'm going to have a lot of the stronger ace-x combos, the pocket aces, the pocket 10s that my opponent doesn't have. But obviously he's going to have a lot of ace-x combos as well. It's a relatively connected board, so he does have a lot of hands that can call. But overall he has such a wide range in the straddle here that I expect a lot of folds as well. He does continue with a call, which I think does make his range consist of a lot of top pair combos, but he's going to be continuing with all of his 10x and his 2x combos for this sizing, as well as all of his straight draws, which he's going to have both the Broadway region at some frequency and the lower suited connected stuff, as well as all of his flush draws. I'd also expect him to be continuing with almost all of his pocket pairs to a single bet of this sizing. We go to the turn, which is the 7 of clubs. I don't think this is a card that's going to interact with my opponent's range at too high of a frequency, unless they have specifically pocket 7s or the 7x of spades. They also could have picked up the backdoor flush draw. This card allows me to retain most of my nut advantage. My opponent would have been raising with some of his 2 pair and sets on the flop. I think that further reduces some of his strongest value. Because of that, I'm going to be continuing here with primarily an overbet sizing. This hand doesn't necessarily get bet every time, but I did pick up a gut shot. And I think the 9 of clubs is an interesting card to continue with, as it does have a lot of blocking properties for a river triple barrel. I also block some of his continuing range with the 10-9 of clubs and the ace-9 of clubs. I do use an overbet sizing of $400, trying to apply the maximum amount of pressure to all of his draws. A lot of those draws are stronger than queen-9 here, and regardless, they still have a ton of equity against my hand. I also want to apply a lot of pressure on all of his medium pairs, as well as some of his ace-x combos here. Again, for the most part, my opponent shouldn't have too many of these stronger ace-x combos, as they would have 3-bet them pre or raise them on the flop. My opponent doesn't make the call. I think this heavily concentrates his hands to some ace-x combos, some pairs and flush draws, as well as some combo draws. The river is the 8 of clubs, which is a pretty interesting one for my specific combo, as I do block some of the value. With the backdoor flush coming in, I think it's much more likely that I have a flush here, as well as the straights. I think my opponent's going to be folding most of those combos on the flop or turn. I think it's very hard for my opponent to have anything stronger than a one pair hand here for the most part. I think by triple barreling for a large sizing here, I can apply a lot of pressure on those top pair combos and fold out most of them. When my opponent checks, I continue for $950. My opponent goes deep into the tank. Ultimately, he does flick in the call. Flip over queen high, and he shows ace jack with the jack of clubs, which I think is a very strong bluff catching candidate here. I expect him to be 3-betting a very high frequency with ace jack pre-flop. It's unfortunate that he had this strong of a top pair combo, and the jack of clubs blocker is extremely relevant here. So great call by my opponent, and he scoops this 3K pot. We see an early position limp, and Duke opens it in the hijack to $50. I look down at 4-3 of diamonds on the button and decide to flat. Typically going to be folding this hand pre-flop, but given my position and the players in the blind, so I don't expect a 3-bet, as well as given the additional dynamic of the nit game, I think this call can be justified. The limper calls behind, and we go 3-ways to the flop with the pot at $165. The flop is the ace of spades, 4 of hearts, 2 of diamonds. It checks to Duke, and he continues for $100. I expect Duke to be continuing with a slightly stronger range, as he is betting into 2 players, but I do think this board is going to be bet by him at a high frequency. He's going to have a lot of these stronger ace-x combos that either ABC would have opened from early position, or I would have 3-bet on the button at a high frequency. Given his slightly stronger c-betting range multi-way, and with a player behind, I should be continuing with a much tighter range here. I think this specific combo, especially in position, has enough going for it. Have the backdoor flush as well as the gut shot, and I prefer calling with a hand like 4-3 as opposed to something like pocket 5s, as I do have additional outs to make 2-pair or trips. This is definitely a combo that I can raise as well, given the additional equity, but I think being in position, I'm going to lean towards call. I flick in the $100 and the initial limper folds. We go heads up to the turn, which is the 10 of clubs. Future continues with a large size of $300. Expect his 2-pair and his stronger ace-x combos to be continuing here, but I do expect a lot of his Broadway combos like king queen and queen jack to continue here at a high frequency. I'm not sure how often he's barreling some of his weaker pairs that gain a lot from denial. I think it's more likely if he does have a hand like pocket 5s that has a little bit of additional equity. My specific hand should probably be mixing in a lot of folds here, but I do have a little bit of additional equity with the gut shot and the 2-pair / trip straw. I also have a combo that unblocks all of his bluffs and blocks his value of ace 4 of diamonds and pocket 4s. So being in position, I decide to make this call. We go to the river, which is the jack of spades, and this time my opponent decides to check. My opponent checks, and I think at this point it's very unlikely that they have a straight, 2-pair, or a set. I think they would have triple barreled those combos at a very high frequency. And although I would have played a lot of my 2 pairs and sets a little bit more aggressively, either pre-flop, on the flop, or the turn, I think it's perfectly reasonable that I have those combos at a slightly higher frequency given my position and the rainbow nature of the board on the turn. There's not a ton of draws out there besides straight draws, and all of those are gut shots, so there's not a ton of outs for a lot of my opponent's hands. Given my opponent is also very likely to have showdown value here, I decide to go for a very massive size versus a somewhat capped range, and I bet $1,350. My opponent tanks for a considerable amount of time, but eventually he does flick in the call. I show my pair of 4s, and he ends up having pocket queens, which is definitely a hand that I would have expected to fold here versus an overbet on the river. So quite the call by my opponent. It worked out for him this time. In this hand, a very aggressive pro opens to $30 from middle position. I elect to flat with 8-7 of clubs in the hijack, and 3 players call behind. The cutoff, the button, and the small blind, and we go 5 ways to the flop with the pot at $160. The flop is the 8 of diamonds, 6 of spades, ace of clubs. Tony continues for a small size of $50. I think he should be a little bit tighter here, especially multi-way, but I think he's often over bluffing these spots, even with 5 players. I think he's going to continue with a lot of hands that have any back doors, as well as a lot of his Broadway combos, especially with this small sizing. I make the call, and it folds around to Duke, and he raises it up to $250. Even Duke's pre-flop action is after 4 other players have already put money into the pot. I expect him to have a somewhat wider range here in the small blind. I think most of his value is going to be sets in 2-pair here. I'm not sure if he has ace-8 offsuit, but I do think he has 8-6 suited here. But I do expect him to have some straight draws that play this way, especially the 9-7 combos. And given how frequently I think Tony is continuing on this board, I expect Duke to be slightly wider. Tony folds and I have such good backdoors that I decide to call in position. This is definitely a little bit thin. We go heads up to the turn with the pot at $710 and the turn is the 8 of hearts, giving me trips. So my hand's definitely improved, but I'm still not ahead of most of his value range, although he could have some of these stronger ace-x combos that decided to raise flop, something like ace-queen or ace-jack. He continues here for a relatively large size of $500, and I think I just have a mandatory call here with trips. We go to the river with the pot at $1,700, and the river is the 5 of hearts, completing the primary draw he has, which is 9-7, and he decides to triple barrel for a pot size bet of $1,700. I think typically overbets are going to be very value heavy here. I think I have the ultimate bluff catcher here, blocking the straight and blocking a lot of the full house combos, as well as having a relatively strong hand myself. But in hindsight, I think it's very hard for my opponent to be bluffing here. There's not too many natural bluffs, just some of the gut shots that miss, something like 10-9, and something like ace-6, whose 2-pair became counterfeited. I don't expect him to be using this large of a sizing if he does have a stronger ace-x combo. And although I'm blocking a lot of the value, there's just really nothing I beat. In the moment, I do make the call, and he ends up having the ace-8 of spades, so he did flop 2-pair and turned the full house, and I get absolutely destroyed in this hand. I open up 8-6 of clubs in the cutoff, both the button and the small blind call, and we go 3 ways to the flop with the pot at $160. Flop is a good one for me as I flop middle pair and a flush draw on the 6 of diamonds, 3 of clubs, 9 of clubs. Checks to me and I continue for $100. This is definitely a board that's going to hit my opponent's ranges a little bit stronger than mine. I'm going to have a lot more of the broadways and over pairs. I'll have a higher concentration of sets and 2-pair, as well as a lot of strong draws. The hand has a ton of equity, but it's often the best hand. Even though I have a very strong draw here, my hand does benefit from denial as well, as I only have a pair of 6s. The button calls, he should be a little bit stronger here, even though he's in position as we are multi-way. I expect him to have a ton of draws here, but more often a single pair, a 9x or a 6x combo. A lot of those are going to have backdoors. The small blind raises it to $450. My hand blocks a bunch of the draws, but there's still a ton of other flush draws and straight draws. I think my opponent's primarily going to be 3-betting pre-flop with pocket 9s from this position, but realistically I think they only have pocket 6s and pocket 3s as strong value. Facing a raise, my hand plays relatively well as a continue. If my opponent has a flush draw, I'm ahead with a pair. And even if they have a hand as strong as a set, I still have a ton of equity. I think I can play my hand as either a call or a raise here. In this instance, I decided to play it as a call, and the button folds behind. We go heads up to the turn, which is the 9 of spades. Overall, I believe this 9's quite a bit better for my range. I don't think my opponent's going to be raising too much 9x on the flop, especially multi-way. And I will be continuing at some frequency with hands like ace-9 through 9-8. This also further reduces my opponent's value, as if they did have pocket 9s that didn't 3-bet pre-flop, it's very unlikely they have pocket 9s now. They did go as wide as a hand like 6-9 suited. Now there's only one combo. So overall, there's very few value hands they can have. They continue for $500, and I decided to play my hand as an all-in for $1,500 effective. Even though the expected value of my hand is extremely high, I think I get blown off my hand on the river, as I often end up with just a pair of 6s. My opponent has very few value hands here, and I think it makes sense to deny equity to his flush draws and straight draws. He does fold, and I get this one through. I open up ace-10 offsuit to $50 on the button over a middle position limp. My opponent makes the call. I expect his range to primarily be pocket pairs, but also going to be some suited connected hands, some suited ace-x combos, and some offsuit broadways. I don't think he has a particularly wide limping range. I think it's going to be mostly medium strength hands. I would expect him to be raising with his strongest hands, so we can cut off some of that value. We go to the flop, which is the 7 of clubs, 4 of clubs, 2 of spades. His Broadway region obviously misses, but a lot of his other combos are going to connect on this board relatively strongly. I expect him to be continuing here with all of his pocket pairs, as well as his suited connectors, which are either a pair or a straight. He's also going to have some ace-x combos like ace-5 and ace-3 that are going to continue to a bet, as well as some flush draws. My opponent checks, and I think my hand can really go either way. I'm primarily going to be using small sizes if I do continue. I elected to continue in this instance, as I do have the ace of clubs, giving me the backdoor flush with my backdoor straight, as well as the 2 overcards. My opponent makes the call, and we go to the turn, which is the 2 of clubs. He checks again, and I decide to barrel for $150. I think the ace of clubs is pretty key here. There's a lot of river cards that can turn my hand into a bluff. I also apply a lot of pressure on his pocket pairs like pocket 5s and pocket 6s, as well as hands like ace-4 and 5-4. I also push out equity of hands that had backdoor spade draws. My opponent does make the call. I think it's pretty unlikely that he does have a full house here. I would expect him to be raising at a high frequency either on the flop or the turn with the sets. I think primarily he's going to have pocket pairs that contain a club, and possibly something like 8-7. So overall, a range that I can apply a lot of pressure on if I choose to on the river. The river is actually a pretty interesting one, as it is the 10 of hearts. I think at this point, I probably have the best hand. My opponent's strongest made hands would have raised, and based on the turn action, I think it is likely that they have a single pair. I was definitely considering polarizing here more often with the ace of clubs, but on this specific river card, I think I want to be going a little bit smaller for value. Obviously, I'd mix in bluffs as well, but I think the ace of clubs in particular prefers to have larger sizes. I choose a value sizing of $350, hoping that he does have something like pocket 8s, pocket 6s, pocket 5s with a club. that he decides to hero call. And this goes well as he does make the call. He has a slightly stronger hand than I expected as he shows up with pocket nines and he does have the club. I think it's a reasonable bluff catcher and I'm glad I was able to get value from it on the river. We just started the Nick game and we see a middle position open to $25 from Outlaw. The hijack button and small blind all call. I looked down at a pretty ugly hand in the big blind with the king deuce offsuit, but I'm getting incredible odds and I'm incentivized to play hands in the Nick game, so I throw in the call. We go 5 ways to the flop, which is the ace of spades, 4 of spades, 3 of clubs, giving me the gut shot and a pretty poor backdoor flush draw. Checks to Outlaw and he continues for $60. I do think he's going to be continuing here at a higher frequency due to the Nick game. He's a very aggressive player in general, although he should be a little bit tighter when we are 5 ways to the flop. But I would expect him to be betting a lot of his weaker pairs to gain denial, as well as a lot of his ace-x combos. Folds around to me, and I decide to raise to $240. I think generally you want to be a little bit more aggressive in the Nick game early, as people are going to be bluff catching you much wider when you are one of the few remaining players with a nip button. Overall, I think I have a much higher concentration of sets, 2 pair, and straights than my opponent here. So I think it makes sense that I incorporate a decent amount of raises here. He does continue with a call, which I think is primarily going to be ace-x combos, although he's going to have some flush draws as well. I think most of his weaker pairs are going to be folding at this point. We go heads up to the turn with the pot at $605. The turn is the queen of spades, which is going to be a much stronger card for my range. My flop checkers bluffs are primarily going to be flush draws here. And I think my opponent's going to be weighted towards ace-x combos, especially with the queen of spades here, which further reduces their flushes. This card also further reduces their strong top pair combos that have a flush draw, as I think my opponent is primarily only opening ace-10 offsuit and better. I'd also expect some 3-bets from hands like ace-king on the flop. So they have a sliver of ace-king, some ace-jack, and some ace-10, which overall is not a lot of combos compared to the rest of the top pair in their range. With this good of a turn card, I do think I want to be barreling here and applying pressure on those ace-x combos. If he does elect to call with top pair, I often have additional equity with my 2 of spades flush draw. Generally, after check raising these type of boards and seeing a turn card that can wildly swing the EV of the value range, I'm going to be using pretty small sizes. I decide to continue here for $225. My opponent thinks for a little bit, but he does flick in the call. We go to the river with the pot at $1,055, and the river is the 4 of clubs. Overall, I think this is a run out that my opponent really didn't want to see. Yes, the 4 of clubs slightly reduces some of my value region, but this specific 4 does it the least amount. I have a much higher concentration of full houses, I have a much higher concentration of flushes, and I have straights that my opponent doesn't have. Because of that, I decided to use a polarizing size and bet $875. Really trying to apply pressure on those top pair combos, which are also now chopping, so something like ace-jack, ace-10 has lost a lot of value in that aspect as well. I think it's really hard for me to have too many natural bluffs here, especially when I've raised multi-way. My opponent thinks so as well, as he does lay down his hand. Appreciate everyone tuning in, appreciate the support. Please like, subscribe, and comment, and regular vlogs will be returning shortly. Thanks.